Hey, welcome everyone for the yet another episode. I have Brent with me. I will let him introduce in a moment, but today's topic is close to my heart. It's about storytelling, and it's more even close because it's about data storytelling. What we are going to do today is data storytelling is often described as a bridge between raw numbers and how we make real decisions. But today's episode is going to focus on what are the common pitfalls in data storytelling. So we are going to unpack that, why they happen, what they cause, how leaders and analysts communicate and communicators can avoid them. So that's going to be the topic for the day. Brent, I know you have a book that you wrote. You're an author of Effective Data Storytelling.
Yeah.
I'll give you an interesting story about that book. So my team started a book club. So we meet on a monthly basis. The first book that we took was your book. It was
hmm
interesting. So we read like few chapters and come back on a monthly basis to review it. So it was interesting. So a lot
hmm
of good nuggets that we got out of how to be effective in data storytelling. Thanks for that, and thanks for being part of the show. So why don't you introduce yourself and we can dive into the topic right away?
Yeah. So Brent Dykes, I'm the author of Effective Data Storytelling, and I've worked in analytics for I've worked in analytics for 2 decades now. Most of my time, 12 of those years, were at Adobe. So the
Hmm.
company that I was working for previously, Omniture was acquired by Adobe, and so that was 12 years there. Then I worked for 4 years at Domo, a BI cloud
Hmm.
based BI solution, and then briefly worked for an agency before going out on my own and launching my own training, consulting, coaching business around data storytelling.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah, impressive. Um, I think a lot of people think about data speaks for itself, but in reality, it rarely does. The moment you
hmm
put some numbers on paper, we as data leaders or whoever is working in the data space will say, this should be pretty easy enough for you to understand. But a lot of times it missed the mark for the audience.
Yeah.
Why do you think so many data presentations are missing the mark in your view?
I think it might be cursive knowledge. That might be a factor at play if you're not familiar with cursive knowledge. For those that are watching or listening to the podcast,
Hmm.
cursive knowledge is really where it's hard for us to not know what we know. And so if we've spent a lot of time with the data, we've analyzed it for hours, days, weeks, we get very familiar with the numbers and what they mean in the
Yes.
context, and in our minds, we can distill the noise from the signal. And then we get excited and we share it with others, thinking that they can process the information the same way that we do and see what we see. And
Yeah.
that's often not the case. And so part of it is self-reflection and really putting ourselves in the shoes of the audience and thinking, how am I going to explain it to people who haven't spent hours and days in the data like I have, and maybe don't
Right.
have the full context. So that's where the
Right.
storytelling comes in, and that's why I think a lot of times data presentations can fail because we overlook that we know a lot more about the data than our audience does.
100% true. Numbers can overwhelm sometimes instead of enlightening the audience. Audience matters. But on the other end, right, you cannot just tell only the stories. You need to probably put the facts, which is why the numbers matters too. But when we talk about the pitfalls, how does one strike a balance between the depth of analysis in terms of projecting the numbers and how they came up with the
Mhm.
number versus clarity on telling the story?
Yeah, I think, well, one thing is obviously you have to understand what is meaningful and important to the audience. That's going to guide you in terms of what do you include in your presentation and what do you exclude. But I think that whole narrative arc or that narrative framework
Hmm.
that you apply to your findings then helps you to kind of organize and really make those critical decisions like, do I include this or do I not include this? What goes into the story? What stays out of the story? If we have that narrative arc to kind of guide us, it's going to help us to really streamline what gets presented and what doesn't. What goes in the appendix? You might
Right.
get a random question about this. Well, we want to be prepared for that, but does that have to be a part of our story? No, because that random question may not come up, and we would have wasted time, anticipating and answering a question that nobody had. So I think
Right.
it's really important to kind of look at that narrative arc that narrative framework and kind of decide, okay, this is what I'm going to share, and then obviously be prepared for those other questions. But I
Yeah,
think that that's a good thing. I really do think that the narrative component is not just about helping our audience to, obviously engage with the content and have it be more memorable and more persuasive, but it actually helps us on the decisions that we need to make about what goes into the story and what stays out. And
yeah,
so
one hundred
I think there's a
percent.
dual benefit.
Yeah, I think you said it really well. What goes into the story and what doesn't, right? That's the hardest thing to do. People
Yeah.
always think about visuals are powerful than verbiage, right? There's always a debate about like, how much we can put from a visual standpoint versus verbiage. Sometimes charts are overwhelming too. But what do you think
Yeah.
are some of the common mistakes that you have seen in the data visualization?
I'm trying to think what would be some of the comment. I mean, I think that there's this. I think a lot of people are like worried that they'll leave something out that'll be critical for the audience to understand, right? So often, what
Hmm.
I'll see when I'm working with different clients and I'm reviewing their decks and kind of understanding how they share data today, before a workshop or whatever, often what I'll see is these very dense slides, where there's lots of text. There's maybe they're cramming in three visuals into the same slide. Then there's just everything's labeled. It's just overwhelming. And
Right,
so I think one of the key things is one of the mistakes that's being made is just it's almost like they're saying, I'm just going to throw all of this at the wall and I hope something sticks, right? Kind of the spaghetti. We'll throw the spaghetti at the wall and hope that something sticks. But in doing that, in throwing all of that information at the wall, you're bombarding your audience with unnecessary noise that they just don't need. And so
right.
it's really about, I kind of talk about you go through this exploration process where you're using visualizations and you're analyzing all kinds of data set, very, very robust data set because you're trying to get
Hmm.
that insight in the numbers. But then there's a transition. Once you've found an insight, once you've got something that you want to communicate to your audience, you then
Hmm.
have to go through that process of editing out information that is too much, it's extra, it's extraneous, it's not necessary to understand the points you're making, and make that adjustment to really from exploratory to explanatory. And I
Right.
think a lot of the time, people, analysts and data professionals, data scientists, we just assume that what worked for us will work equally well for our audience. Again, that curse of knowledge coming in. But we do have to make an adjustment. We do need to remove the noise, maybe reduce the data set, just focus on what are the key points and make those points as powerfully as we can.
Yeah, I think you said it well, exploratory to explanatory. In my view, context is the king, right? Context is everything. Probably like on the same lines, do you have an example that you can share for the audience where you have
Yeah,
seen the business or the human context made a data story fail? The lack of
yeah. So
business or
I,
the human context. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I'll share a hypothetical because I actually did a LinkedIn post about this today
Yeah,
where I
I
just
follow.
talked
By
about,
the way, sorry to interrupt you, Brett. I follow your LinkedIn, and there's a lot of good nuggets. So those who are listening, I would strongly recommend to follow Brent because he shares a lot of good nuggets. When it comes to data storytelling. Sorry, go for it.
yeah, yeah. So one of the things I see is often, people will see one data point and react to it. They'll jump to some judgment, right? They'll leap to a judgment or jump to a conclusion or whatever. Uh, and so the hypothetical example I share is that I have a graph where I show there's 6 months of data, and then in the last month of data, the sales are down. And so I have an executive who's leaping to a judgment saying, oh, it's marketing has dropped the ball again. Here we go. And then the last kind of action that they take is that, they let some of their marketing team go because clearly they've dropped the ball in the most recent sales. And I
Yeah.
call that the rush. That's a rush story, right?
Yep.
You're jumping to some judgment. And we see if you work in data, in analytics, you're going to see this all the time. You see somebody sees a statistic, they react to it, they make some rash judgment or some rash decision,
Hmm.
And that's not really being data driven. That's, I mean, yeah,
Yes.
sure, a data influenced a decision, but it not in the right way. And so then I contrast that with, well, with a data story, we're not leaping to judgment. What we're doing is we're walking with facts. So we're gonna in the bottom example, I take that same scenario where sales are down in the
Hmm.
6 month, but what do the leaders do? Well, they say, let's dig deeper. Let's go deeper.
Yeah.
I want to understand what's going on here. Let's
Hmm.
get that context to understand why the sales are down in the 6 month. And then when they start to unpack it, the first thing they realize is that the East region
Hmm.
has had some massive storms that have interrupted their shipping for 2 months of that month. And so that's why the sales are down because they're not able to get the product into the stores. And then the
Right.
second thing, when we look at the marketing team's efforts in the unaffected regions outside of this region that was affected by the storm, these other regions that weren't, we see that marketing actually had a 20% lift on sales in those regions. And so rather than firing members of the marketing team, we should be celebrating that they were able to, you know, get a good result on their promotions and their campaigns. And
Right.
it was
Right.
this other factor that led to the lower sales was this storm, these severe storms in our east region. And so I think that just kind of points to how if we don't get enough context, if we don't dive into the numbers more deeply and really try and come up rather than jumping to a conclusion, try and really understand what's going on and
Right.
then make
Right.
a more measured decision, based on context and data.
Yeah, I think you said it well when it comes to data-driven decisions. But I'm going to put you on spot, Brent, a little bit. So when you meet with stakeholders or when you meet with leaders, oftentimes you may see that they come with their own biases, right?
Hmm.
Whether it's a gut-based bias or experience-based bias, you never know. But the real thing is going to be how you can elevate your data-driven story, right, in
Yeah.
front of the stakeholders. But how do you design data stories that both inform and also challenge this situation without alienating it?
Yeah, I think it's important to really understand where the audience is in terms of and actually I wrote a Forbes article on this, like how do we overcome that resistance? And so in that I started with a 4x4 matrix, and then I was like, wait a second, there's actually a little bit of nuance here. So it ended up being a 2x6.
Hmm.
Uh, Anyways, it was kind of, you'll have to see in the article, and I'm sure we can share a link to it. But in that article, I identified that there's different scenarios in which we react, or our audience could react differently to the data that we're sharing. And in
Right.
each case, we need to prepare for that. And so that
Hmm.
may mean that, for example, it's going to be at a very simplistic level. It's very, it's a very different situation where the audience will welcome the results. They're
Hmm.
actually excited and they're going to receive the information positively. That is a much different scenario than if it was maybe they proposed some new program and they were super excited about it, and you have data that shows that that program was a terrible failure so far. Presenting that story is going to be very different in how you handle that. And so a lot of it comes down to having empathy, knowing our audience as well. Like if we're going into that situation where we really don't know the audience and how they'll react, we need to tread lightly. We need to be careful. It's
Right.
much better if we know the audience. What are going to be the objections? Can we prepare for those objections? I mean, ultimately, while we can't control people's emotions and maybe we can't, maybe they have a personal agenda or something that's not aligned with the company and what the company should be doing. We have to
Mm.
navigate those waters, but I think it's much easier when we understand what we're facing. If we don't understand the position where the audience is coming from, we can be very reckless in how we communicate. And
Right.
sometimes I wonder if there's analysts and data professionals out there that are communicating in a way where they really don't understand the audience and their ideas or their insights are coming across facing some resistance, and they're not doing a good job in how they adjust to kind of help people
Right.
overcome some of
Right.
those forms of resistance and get them to actually see it in a new light, and maybe and sometimes it's just the positioning, how we word, how we message can make a huge difference. If we're
Right.
blaming them, if we're putting them on the spot as this was a terrible decision that you made, how are
Right.
people going to react? Whereas maybe we approach it differently. We say, how, when we look at this, we rolled out this new program, or we rolled out this new campaign or promotion, doesn't look like it worked for our customers. How can we, and you shifted away from placing blame to
Mm-hmm.
how do we
Mm-hmm.
serve our customers then? How do we fix this situation for our customers? And in that case, then we're all, we all want to contribute. We all, hopefully some of those walls will come down, and they'll interpret and see the data differently.
Right, right. I think you talked about the trust aspect, the credibility aspect, but it is getting fragile in the age of data overload, right? But given the AI coming into picture, it is getting much worse, right? When you lose the trust, I think when you have the
Yeah.
numbers wrong, or when you are giving the wrong answers to the questions or the prompts, I think you will lose
Yeah.
the trust right at that moment, right? Uh,
Yeah.
but 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 I'm curious to know, like when you get into these such kind of situation, right? Because you're not going to be successful at the first run itself.
Mm.
So where do
Yeah.
you see trust being lost most often in data narratives, and how can we, most importantly, how can we rebuild those?
Yeah. Well, I think there's two, I kind of see data as the foundation of what we're doing with data storytelling. So there's two ways that you can erode that trust in the numbers. One is just data quality. If people are seeing poor data, like there's inconsistencies in the numbers, or maybe I've even been in situations where maybe the analysts made a mistake in how they were analyzing
Mm-hmm.
the data and
Mm-hmm.
introduced errors, not because the data was poor quality, but because they did a poor quality job on the analysis or interpreting the numbers. So I think it's really critical to obviously work with data that's going to be that people will accept and trust. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's probably, I would say, don't start telling data stories if nobody trusts the data that you're telling stories from. That, like, stop. Do not pass go. Do not
Right.
move on. If you have an issue with the data that you're telling stories from, that's never going to get better. You're never going to be able to make the data as pretty or engaging, because at the end of the day, the fundamental issue is that people just don't trust the numbers. So definitely, data quality is one. And then I would say the other thing that I think can happen, and again, it's that foundation, is that you are not presenting information that's relevant to the stakeholders. Meaning,
Yeah.
if the data is not aligned with their priorities, what they're focused on, uh, the objectives that they're tasked with, then you're just wasting their time. And that can lead to frustration as well. It's like,
Right.
why are you telling me this story? I don't even, that's like the bottom of my list. I don't care about that. I need to, here's what I'm focused on. I'm focused on these three things, and you've wasted, you know, 15 minutes of my time talking about this other issue that's not at the top of my list of, priorities. And so that's another area. If the data is not relevant, if the insight is not relevant, no matter how
Yeah.
amazing we think that insight is, that doesn't matter if it's not relevant to your audience. I mean, so I think those are the two areas that you can make simple mistakes with the trust, because it is,
Yeah.
like what you said, it is a relationship that, hopefully over time, as you work with these different stakeholders, as you work with different teams, and you're telling data stories, that over time you start to build that credibility, and you do that by
Yeah.
having
It takes time. It
good,
takes
reliable
time.
data,
Yeah.
relevant data, and then you're going to build a really strong relationship of trust.
Right, right. I think it takes time, but once you have the trust and the credibility, I think you can just ride along the journey. But you need to make sure that you have to be consistent in how you tell the story. Know your audience. Context is
Yeah.
the king. Know what you need to put, what you should not put. A lot of good nuggets. So just on the fun side, I think some of the best storytellings or the data stories come from unexpected places. Have you seen anything that landed surprisingly well, and why? And what is the story?
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting question. I mean, I think there's two parts to that. I mean, I always believe that the really powerful data stories are built on an insight. And you might say, well, no, yeah, no big surprise there. But I want to just clarify something, and maybe to your listeners, is that I think in analytics and in data science, we use the word insight very loosely, very
Hmm.
almost too casually. And I've been trying to kind of beat this drum that we need to be very specific with how we use the word insight. In part of going back to when I was writing my book, I was reviewing it with different people before I published it, and
Hmm.
two of the reviewers actually came back to me and said, "Hey, Brent, you use this word insight a lot, in your chapters, but you haven't really defined it." And they both of these independently said you need to define what you mean by insight. And I was like, "Oh, this is great feedback. Awesome." And so then I went back and I was going to write something for the first chapter, and I was like, wait a second, what is an insight? I use the word very, very frequently, but have I really stopped and thought, what is an insight? And that's when I started to struggle, because as I looked at different, I couldn't come up with my own definition. And then I started looking at the dictionary definitions, and then I was like, oh, these aren't very good. These
Yeah.
don't, they didn't ring true to me what an insight really was. And then somebody pointed me to a definition that was provided by an author and psychologist by the name of Gary Klein.
Mm.
And he defined an insight as an unexpected shift in the way we understand things. And for me, that's when my light bulb went off, and that's when I had my aha moment. I was like, "Oh, wow, that's a good It's very clean, very short, very concise, but it kind of represents really what I feel an insight is that the organization, the leader, myself, whoever it is, has some kind of understanding of the world, and then the data tells us it yields something different. It kind
Right.
of like an unexpectedly kind of changes our perspective on something. So we see, maybe it's our customers, maybe we see our competition, maybe we see the marketplace, maybe we see a business process that's broken or whatever. We see it in a new light. We see it,
Yeah.
our
Wow.
our perspective has changed. And so I think, going back to your original point, I believe that some of the best data stories are when you have an insight, one of those unexpected
Good
shifts in
moments.
the yeah, and then obviously the magnitude of that is, if it's something where the whole company believes that, maybe this industry is, we can never compete in that industry, or maybe this particular customer profile is a big fan of our product. And then we've done
Hmm.
some kind of analysis, and we found, oh, actually, it's not that customer segment. It's this other one,
Right.
related, but
Hmm.
but not how we currently define it. It's a smaller segment, a subsegment of that segment that's really driving our sales. And then bringing that to the organization and sharing that. And then I always talk about, like, once you kind of have one of these unexpected shifts in our understanding, let's say with this particular segment, this more refined segment that we've identified, how does that cascade through the business? All of a
Right.
sudden that changes how we market. No, we're not going to be marketing to this broader segment. We're going to be more precise and target this sub-segment of customers. And then, we go to the engineering side. Well, we've been designing our product to service the needs of this larger segment. Well, what changes would we need to make it even more sticky and powerful for this sub-segment? And
Hmm.
then how would that change our product roadmap and different, so there's this cascading effect. Once you have one of these really big insights, it can cascade through all aspects of the business, from operations to finance to customer support to sales, marketing. I mean, everything can be impacted. So that's really powerful stuff. But I think it all hinges on having an insight, a true insight, not just, you know. not just an observation, as I kind of draw a contrast between, oh, we can see that sales went up 200% last week. Okay, well that's the what. That's an observation. It's interesting, but until we understand the why of
Right.
what caused that 200% increase, we really don't have an insight.
Yeah, I think well said. Good way of looking at what is an insight, right? We often talk about an insight, an action, and a value. I think we have to ground ourselves on what does that really mean, right? Thanks for telling the story about your journey. And for those who are listening, I would strongly recommend to read the Effective Data Storytelling book. Brent, I know you're a busy guy. Thanks for taking the time to be part of the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.